Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture of the URMC 21-Day Racial Justice Challenge. My name is Norma Holland, Director of Public Relations and Engagement for the University of Rochester Medical Center Office of Equity and Inclusion. We thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate that you have all taken time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. This is the second lecture, as I mentioned earlier, so I want to say welcome to our guest speaker today, Ms. Julia Egan she's coordinator of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Penn State Scranton. We thank you for being with us today, Julia. Ms. Egan is passionate in her diversity work around anti-racism, decolonization, and LGBTQ plus and women's issues. Her lecture today is brought to you by the Association of Minority Residents and Fellows, or AMRF, and the URMC Office of Equity and Inclusion. With us today are AMRF President Dr. Michelle Sainville, who's joining us today, as well as Vice President Dr. Gilda Johnson. So thank you so much. Dr. Sainville will moderate today's question and answer portion, and Dr. Gilda Johnson will wrap us up today with some parting words at the end of the lecture. ASL interpreting and captioning are available for this event today. Please note our interpreters, Tracy Winters and Rashida Jackson today. We thank you for their time. Our captioner is Tracy Steele today. In order to best enjoy today's presentation, please make sure that your view as a participant is set to gallery view. Also, I want to recognize Odessa and Tommy, who are joining Ms. Egan today. They are going to be running the PowerPoint for Ms. Egan. Odessa is a specialist coordinator for 540 West Main, and Tommy is an intern for 540 West Main, also from the University of Rochester. So we thank them both for their time today. And don't forget, we also want to make sure that you know that closed captioning is available externally at the link that the captioner has placed in chat. If you have any questions, please be sure to put them in Q&A, and Dr. Sainville will make sure to get to them when Ms. Egan is ready for the Q&A portion. So without any further ado, I would like to welcome Ms. Julia Egan from Penn State Scranton.
Thank you, Norma, for that kind introduction. So welcome, everyone. I'm excited to be here with you today. I will try to be mindful of the ASL and the closed captioning as it is running, but I also want to be mindful of time as well. So if you have questions, please save them until the discussion or the Q&A portion. And I just wanted to give a brief trigger warning. Today we will be discussing some heavy topics along with our 21-day equity challenge around racial trauma, Black death, including the murder of Black people, and historical trauma. So I just want to prepare you for that as we go through. And today we kick off week 2 with expanding perspectives. So Odessa, I'm going to ask you to pull up the slides, please, if you don't mind. Thank you. So we're in week 2, and we are going to start expanding our perspectives, most notably of underrepresented experiences in the community, right? So I wanted to start by asking you to take out a piece of paper and a writing implement if you have one. If not, just keep mental notes up here. And I wanted to start with some major takeaways that we've gotten up until this point. I have taken the liberty of going through your sort of curriculum, as it were, with you as you embark on this journey. And excuse me, apologies. And I just wanted to kind of sum up, right, things that you're learning as you are going through this. So to prepare you for week 2 and to prepare you to expand that perspective. So one thing that you learned right off the bat in day 1 is that racial identities are fluid. This means that, there's not just a monolithic Black, there's not just a monolithic white. There are many different ethnicities, there are different identities that encompass and make up, that constitute these words, right? And then we can see, right, in that race is a social construct. It's not biological. Despite the waves of science, pseudoscience really, like eugenics, that have tried to prove that race is biological, we can see already that because racial identity is fluid, that it is also social. And then getting more into the specifics, we can also see that Black people and other people of color are constantly proving themselves against norms, right? You saw this on day 2 in the videos that you were watching, Brown versus Board, in the education of desegregated schools. So people of color, people who have been marginalized or oppressed, are constantly proving themselves against harmful norms that are reinforced by white supremacy. And then we can see that positive stereotypes do not exist, right? That is another thing that has been created by the oppressor. That is not something that originated from Brown and Black communities in America. Another takeaway we might walk away with is that systemic racism has economic motives. You've seen this in the content you engaged with around redlining, around redistricting, around voter suppression. All of these big systems are linked together that are meant to reinforce, an economy where white people are in power, and unfortunately, that leaves Black and Brown people, Indigenous people, other people who have been marginalized at the bottom. We saw this when, they were talking about the homeowner loan corporation, right? And how Black families weren't able to get proper housing on the market, early in the 20th century. They weren't given out loans, to get houses in respectable, quote unquote, districts, right? And that too, we can see that housing equity issues then lead to health equity issues, right? As they start to district Black folks into certain areas of the state or areas of the county, they're not getting proper access to healthcare. They're not getting proper access to living conditions, water, other things like that, other infrastructural resources are not available to Black and Brown folks. And then we see that in the week on immigration, we see that different groups of Blacks face different challenges. For instance, a Black resident citizen versus a Black immigrant may face different challenges within the legal system and systemic economic opportunity in America, right? And Black immigrants have pointed out that they have been largely left out of the conversation of racism in America against Black people. So that's something to keep in mind. And from there, we can see that trauma, intergenerational, psychological, emotional, and physical wounds are created by this historical trauma, right? I would say that the overarching theme of week 1 is to really point out how the historical trauma has been created and how it has affected marginalized and oppressed communities throughout the decades, right? It leads to higher rates of mental and physical illness. That is one outcome of this intergenerational trauma in Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. And historical traumas are events that target whole communities. That's important because we have to understand that not only is racism personal and interpersonal, it is systemic, right? And these traumas lead to the destruction of culture. You might have remembered that video from Bill Deans where he talks about level 1, cultural destructivity, right? that leaves messages which are rooted in history and played out later in sociocultural spheres like pop culture. So when we talk about social cultural sphere, right, we might think of movies or toys or entertainment. So this plays out in games like Cops and Robbers. That's an obvious one. It plays out in playing dolls, which you saw in A Girl Like Me video. It also plays out in games like Cowboys and Indians, right? And that leaves us with the conclusion that brown and Black folks don't want to be re-traumatized via these spheres, despite being in the 21st century in 2022. We have not superseded these infrastructures of racism, right? We are still traumatized as brown and Black folks who have to now linger with the collateral damage of racism that was enforced centuries ago. So if you would go to the next 2 slides, Odessa. There we go. Thank you. I want to get into a bit of a discussion here. So I would say I can't really see all of you right now, but you know, if you want to raise a hand and jump in, that will bring you to the top of the screen. But I want to get into sort of facilitated dialogue here about how we foster racial discrimination. How can we expand our perspective to remain aware that we reinforce institutional racism and how we can commit to move forward? So you're all a part of the medical community. Oh, I see a question. Why am I not visible and not have any controls like a raising hand? I do not know. Michelle or Norma, do you want to jump in?
It's now an option. You can do so.
Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so I want to ask you as members of the medical community, you know, how does this institution, University of Rochester Medical Center, remain aware of systemic biases and its impact on patients, colleagues, and friends? I just want you to take a minute to think about that. And then if anyone has any thoughts, please jump in.
You can also put them in Q&A if you'd like.
It might also be something that came up in a recent encounter personally.
Jill Del Vecchio
Yes.
has her hand up.
Okay, yes, and I can repeat the question as well. So the question is how does this institution, right, remain aware of systemic biases and their impact on patients, colleagues, and friends? And then I will let Jill, I believe, speak. Okay, no problem. Okay, so maybe I'll ask another question. What areas have you noticed historical trauma in healthcare? What areas have you noticed historical trauma in healthcare? And this may be a personal experience as well. You can also think back to what you've seen or read as part of the challenge already. I see Richard in the Q&A. I think the university remains aware of biases through constant educational opportunities such as guest speakers, trainings, and other educational opportunities through my path. Oh, great. So it seems like there's a platform as well, responding to patients' pain and perpetuated myths. Karen, can I ask you to elaborate more on that? I love that that phrase, perpetuated myths, such as, and I see things coming in the chat as well. This one of the ways that racism has persisted. Black patients have thicker skin. Absolutely. And not just physically, right? But also mentally and emotionally, that Black folks, you know, aren't mentally more resilient or mentally strong, and that they are not, of course, which is of course not true. Absolutely. What else? I see things appearing in the chat. Clients are not always willing to reach out to providers for that help because they have poor experiences with professionals. Absolutely. I remember being in the healthcare system with a white therapist who was not very receptive to my experience with domestic violence, even though I was telling her about being gaslighted, about being emotionally battered. And she was like, well, why don't you just leave? And I was like, well, because I'm afraid for my life. And it was not only a misunderstanding of the power dynamic of race that played a factor in that relationship, but just a misunderstanding altogether of, I think, the entire situation. Vilma is sharing a personal experience, the assumption that people need to be yelled at in the attempt to help a PT understand, or being asked if you are thinking in Spanish, and the gaslit as these things being brought up. Patient, thank you. Right, totally. So there are issues of language as well, right? There's issues of language we have to attend to when we're dealing with patients. Even among colleagues who may be bilingual or trilingual, I mean, what does it matter what language they're thinking in? They're still processing. If they're understanding you, they don't need a further explanation. They don't need to be further pedantically, like, you know, made to feel indignified, right? Things like that. I see other things popping in the Q&A. To answer the first question, this is from Brooke. URMC has had a thrive transgender healthcare respecting individuals, valuing everyone clinical advisory committee since 2017, which has sought to identify and improve the specific experience of patients with trans experience. The committee has moved slowly over the years and has been more effective in changing policy since it has a paid leadership. Okay, Brooke, are you comfortable unmuting yourself and speaking more about the progress that has been made? If not, feel
Brooke,
free to type in the chat.
Brooke, this is Norma. You can go ahead and speak, please.
Oh, thanks, Norma. Thank you, Julia. The committee has done some good things. We have removed gender from risk tags and have been working very focused on trying to get a space for patients' pronouns on the first screen so that every provider will be able to see that when somebody comes in. And there has been work as well on trying to connect the systems. So even if somebody comes in and their provider sees them and they have the right pronouns, they might, our nutrition services, for example, aren't connected to that same system. So they might get misgendered on the food that comes to them in their room. So that's been identified as a challenge and something that needs to happen. And there also has been some training added to MyPath, as somebody else alluded to, that has been helpful in terms of pronoun use. And there's still a lot that needs to be done, and trying to create a concerted effort throughout the university is really important. And how do you get the departments who haven't requested any training to come to the table and to ensure that patients who are entering their services are being treated appropriately? So So it's been moving along. It's been really trying very hard to make some changes. And now that there is a paid person who is some percentage of her salary is to actually get this group to move forward, that's been super helpful in terms of making sure that policy changes are actually implemented, just because it keeps falling to the bottom of the to-do list, or it did in the first few years. So
yeah, that's so interesting. Money talks, right? But also, thank you, Calvin pointed out in the chat that there have been many public examples in the news. Trans patients being misgendered deliberately, you know, by members of the URMC staff and community. So obviously this initiative is good, right? But there are still holes there, you know, on the individual basis, and we'll get to this. We'll talk about the personal, interpersonal, and systemic levels of kind of microaggressional action, and then action we can take to combat that. There's still room to grow, and it can't really fall on just one person. This is a community initiative, right? So maybe in the action portion of the presentation, we can talk about how to invite people to that space who are either reluctant, recalcitrant, or just unaware, right, that they need to come to this space. Okay, so the last thing I kind of want to talk about here is just, you know, making you aware that it is okay to question and remain interrogating of resources, right? Thank you, Tommy, for that. So there have been a few examples in your 21-day equity challenge that have provided, you know, good information to educate you about anti-racism. However, some of the language it has used has been a little problematic, and then it leaves room for the message to also be problematic. And I say problematic as in harmful, right? Towards perpetuating ideas of systemic racism. So I want to make you aware of the cultural competency video by Bill Deans on day 5. If you remember that video, he went through kind of 6 levels of cultural competency. And, you know, the language he used was words like minority, right? And while we want to talk about groups that have been marginalized and oppressed, we don't want to make it seem like they just got there on their own, right? We want to hold the system accountable. So instead of saying minority, you can change it to minoritized or oppressed ED, right? Or marginalized ED, to show the verb, right? To show the accountability of the harm done. That's important because it's a power differential. So you want to make that clear. The other thing to note about this video is representation. Whenever you're looking at a source, ask yourself these questions. Who is it? Who is the author, right? Who is the author of the source? Who sponsored it or published it, right? And what message is it saying? And then you can ask yourself a 4th question. Do you agree? Do you agree? It is okay, and there are many sources out there that try to educate about anti-racism that really don't go all the way, or sometimes spread misinformation. So it's our job, right, as engagers with this content to be critical. The representation here is, you can clearly tell this is a British source because of words like characterized. It was spelled with an S, right, instead of a Z, or as they might say in England, a Z. And thus we have to recognize, right, that goes way back to a history of colonization that started in Europe, that started in, you know, with the British colonies, French colonies, other colonies that were looking to expand and colonize other continents. So we always have to be mindful of where we're getting our sources from as well, and when we engage with it, how we engage. Overall, this video itself is a bit vague in scope of defining the terms of cultural awareness and cultural competency, and it leaves much room to perpetuate the harm towards BIPOC people. And you want to ask yourself always when you engage with a source, does this information tell me what I need to know to combat oppression and promote community wellness? If so, how much? If not, what's missing or what's there that gets in the way, right? Another source I'd like to bring your attention to is in the economic portion of what you've been going through. It was the Rochester Metro Economic Indicators. So now we're bringing it even on a smaller scale, and we're bringing it home to Rochester. And this packet was taken from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 2021, and it shows statistics of population rates, unemployment, employment, and the labor force from 2000 to 2022. And it starts out by saying that Rochester is the third largest metropolitan area in New York State. Rochester's economy was historically centered around large manufacturing companies such as Eastman Kodak, Bausch & Lomb, and Xerox, but the number of manufacturing jobs in the region has shrunk considerably since the 1980s. Now, despite it being 4 pages long, there is nothing. There are no demographics listed here that show any indicator of race. It shows no indicator of educational degree earned. And these are important for understanding how this economic wealth is distributed. It's important for understanding who's unemployed, right? It's also important for understanding, well, who is contributing to this economic boom pre-1980, right? Who is working at Eastman Kodak? Who's working at Bausch & Lomb? Were there Black people, if any, working at these places? We don't know from this information. So there's stuff missing. And it's just important to be mindful of that as you go through sources. So that's what I wanted to talk about in the discussion portion. Odessa, if you could go 1 slide back, please. Thank you.
We also have a question from the audience, Paul Vermillion.
Okay. Michelle, would you like to tell me what the question is?
He raised his hand.
Okay.
Paul?
Yes, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask the question. Okay, it was an accident.
Accidental.
Okay, no problem. Well, then we'll move on. So in expanding our perspective, I wanted to start honing in on how URMC is engaging with its local community in Rochester. And this is where I feel that a discussion about Daniel Prude is helpful. This is going to be the hard part of the presentation. So just, try to give yourself space, take it with a grain of salt, but also check in with yourself from time to time. When we talk about underrepresented experiences up until this point in the medical community, I find that the mental health community is still largely under-discussed. There still isn't the infrastructure really to attend to our most vulnerable communities, and that includes the mental health community and those who live with mental illness. The United States has one of the highest suicide rates in the world. Just for some statistics for you, suicide rates have tripled among youth in Rochester over the past 3 years since 2019. Though the statistics show that Blacks are less likely to die from suicide than whites are, Black youth and teenagers are more likely to attempt suicide than white youth and teenagers at a whopping 9.8% versus 6.1% taken from a CDC survey. This also means that Americans with mental illness make up nearly a quarter of those murdered by the police. This is problematic, right? And this is a big problem. To understand the scope, to talk about it through the experience and murder of Daniel Prude, I feel is not enough, but it is one helpful way that we might begin to address this. So for those who don't know, but should know, Daniel Prude was an individual who had tried to jump in front of a train. He jumped 21 stories down the stairs trying to end his life after a prolonged battle with a PCP addiction, and was murdered by the police thereafter. And he was irresponsibly and prematurely released from the hospital earlier that day. So though some cops undergo crisis intervention team training, in general, they are still ill-equipped to answer mental health calls. And we have to ask ourselves, what is being done to improve mental health training for officers if we can't defund this part of the legal system that is unjust towards marginalized groups of people in Rochester altogether? We can ask ourselves too to imagine, right? We can imagine what had happened if Daniel Prude hadn't been released from the hospital. We can ask ourselves, what might the outcome have been if mental health professionals were the first responders instead of the police, right? Would Daniel Prude still be with us? You know, we cannot say for sure, but the answer, I would hope, is most likely yes. In fact, a very high percentage, I would think, would be yes. So Daniel's Law, which was introduced to say that mental health professionals could be first responders and should be first responders in mental health calls, is still an unpassed bill, and it is not enough to address the systemic mistreatment Daniel and other Black folks get in places like Strong Hospital, which is operated by the University of Rochester Medical Center, and medical institutions in America writ large. I too have experienced this firsthand as a brown woman who was in an inpatient program in CPEP at Strong Hospital. 70% of people of color in general aren't receiving proper treatment for mental illness, and less than 20% of medical practitioners are people of color in the mental health field. I even still on intake packets, when they ask about my medical family history, you know, it's traumatizing to me as an adoptee. I'm adopted from Colombia, South America, and I don't know if my mother has Parkinson's. I don't know if my dad has diabetes. I just don't know this information, but it's traumatizing to re-experience it every single intake I have to do, every single doctor's office I visit. I'm constantly asked about my medical family history, and I don't know. So that is another example, right, about systemic harm done in the medical community to underrepresented, marginalized, oppressed folks. So Odessa, if you would go 2 slides forward, please. So we can talk about some action ideas, right? What do we do with all of this information? It seems like an insurmountable feat at this point, but it's not. And we can even take small steps and they can grow into larger actions. So after hearing this presentation, some personal actions we can take are seeing people's humanity. In order to move forward and to have a dialogue and to understand someone's needs, this is paramount to treat and care in the mental health community and in the medical community by and large. Interpersonally, this needs to start becoming a feedback loop, dialogical between employee and employer, between patient and medical professional, and between so many spheres of populations in the medical community. And on a systemic level, we need to attend to the role of race in institutional economies to understand how institutional racism contributes to the systemic infrastructure of the United States and other places where white supremacy is enforced or the extremely harmful norm. And with that, I will go to the next slide. And I want to open up this time for questions and discussion so that we can facilitate a dialogue on further action that can be taken. After hearing this presentation, engaging with the content you have already in this 21-day equity challenge, what are some thoughts that come to mind? Are there questions you have, and are there actions that you can take or that you can offer to the medical community? And I see the chat here. Oh, great, Rebecca. It's great to know there were Latinos working in Kodak. Unfortunately, that information was not represented in the chart. I see from Vilma that sometimes folks are skipping through MyPath trainings. And we have to ask ourselves why. Are they helpful trainings? Are they unhelpful? Are they not engaging participants? Or is it truly a robust training and people are not able to be self-reflexive and acknowledge still what's getting in the way of them on the inside to do this work? Anyone else with a question? There's never enough time to do MyPath. And I've personally never gone through a MyPath training myself, but I would, that's something to probably bring up with your director or coordinator. Like, if there's not enough time, how do you give yourself the appropriate time to go through this training, right? Vilma, again, with there's always the same people, the same faces at these discussions, trainings, and other platforms. It seems to be something that we need to take care of these concerns and figure it out and share if they're open. Vilma, are you comfortable saying more, either in the chat or unmuting yourself?
Vilma, if you wish, you can speak.
Oh, hello.
Hi, hello.
Hi. It's just whenever I've had the opportunity to either go to the trainings, there's always the same set of people, maybe one or two, but there's always the same people that you sort of see having these discussions. And so we go back, we talk, and we have a lot of feedback, which is great, for each other. And then it always seems that we have to report back to, like, if we were the spokesperson, we have to report back to our departments or our groups or, just the people that are open to having those discussions, but not everyone is open to having them. As if it was something that, like, yes, they're uncomfortable, but it's okay to be uncomfortable, because that's how we're going to grow. But it seems to be too uncomfortable to the point that nobody wants to have the conversation.
Right, absolutely. And it's difficult to know how to invite those people into the trainings, although that might mean that you could do a reverse where you start having these conversations outside of a training atmosphere, or you use an example in real time to point out, things that your other colleagues who may be obstinate to join these trainings still need to be aware of, even if it's not directly calling them out, but rather you can use an example from your own practice, or you can use an example from a senior's practice and they can say, whoa, I didn't know that, right? And then you can invite them in that way. So it's not as like you're on two opposing sides, but rather you're together in this learning process, right? And then you might actually invite more people in that way. I see from Karen responding to Vilma, I think that resonates with what we know. People engaged and interested in a topic area tend to keep going back to those opportunities to learn more. And I think this work has to be embedded in what we do, which requires ongoing mindfulness. Totally. Thank you, Karen. And AJ, I think staff should be required to go through bias trainings in order to help identify where their personal biases are prior to starting with clients during their orientation. This could help people increase self-awareness and to prevent discrimination while they support clients. As well, too, as potentially connecting providers with patients who may be, you know, more receptive to their backgrounds, right? I think that's important, especially, I mean, I can say as a patient and never a provider, I always appreciate if I have a female doctor, or I appreciate if that doctor is a woman of color. Obviously, there isn't always the choice and people's preferences are different, but it is good to have somebody who can properly empathize with you and isn't, you know, always a trained psychiatrist or isn't always a trained psychologist. You're not always going to have that support system in place.
Paul also had a question for you. He said, at our recent palliative care conference, there was a presentation on instituting a standard question as part of every inpatient consult in which patients were asked if they ever felt they were treated differently than other patients. Your presentation raises the question of whether this risks traumatizing patients by making them relive that. How do you suggest balancing those two needs, wanting to understand how patients and families experience shape their medical decision-making with not wanting to further traumatize?
Paul, that's a great question. And I think a simple answer to that is that you may ask the question and patients don't have to answer, right? Patients can say, I'm not comfortable answering that, or that's too much for me. I've never been forced to give information that I wasn't comfortable giving. So I would say if that's something you're going to put on an intake sheet, don't do that, because if you're forcing them to answer, that could be traumatizing. But if that's something that you're doing in your intake conversation with them, they have the choice to respond or to not respond. And in that way, it's up to them to set a boundary too, right? Patients do still have responsibilities to set boundaries and also form that healthy relationship. So I hope that is kind of helpful and answers your question.
So it looks like Ms. Quinn also has a question for Dr. Vermillion. She says, I'm curious what the tangible interventions would be that follow a patient reporting yes to those questions. And if the solution is that we perform those interventions for marginalized populations, regardless of them having to ask for them.
Does Dr. Vermillion want to answer? It's a good question.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So in our, at least as far as I understand the intention of that intervention, it was carried out at NYU. And the intervention itself is actually asking the question in many ways and was intended to better enhance the palliative care team's understanding of the patient and their approach to medical decision-making, because we are so often tasked with trying to help guide a family through really tough medical decisions. And so much of that communication relies on the context in which patients live. And as a white cis male provider, it is often so difficult to reach a shared understanding of where different patients are coming from. And by inviting patients to share their own experience with discrimination in healthcare, the hope is that it opens up a safer space for them to speak freely about their perspectives.
Paul, I think too, a great thing that Ms. Quinn, Tessia Quinn raises is about advocacy as well. Advocacy, it's tricky in the mental health, in the medical community, because, you know, you have to, again, ask for consent. I mean, not everybody also wants medical professionals advocating for them, but I think there's also room to, again, with mindfulness practice, be conscious of when there are moments where you do need to advocate for your patients. And that too, I think is like, would be a good follow-up step. It's like, okay, what do I do with this information? Despite having facilitated a safe space now in my patient exam room, you know, now what? Like, how can I make sure this doesn't happen to this individual X again? Or how can I make sure it doesn't happen to other individuals through that prolonged advocacy work, right? Other questions? And I just want to thank Rashida and Tracy right now for interpreting as well.
We've got a comment. Erin Good. She says, we are doing a lot more work in learning about historical trauma and the foundations of structural racism as an institution, but we are still completely disconnected from the experience of members of the BIPOC community. We are still the ivory tower until we actually act with our time and our wallets as an institution to support the city communities, as well as recognize and reach out to the communities we have marginalized and oppressed and take steps to make amends, to actively become anti-racist. We need actual change on the ground, either through policy change, rezoning of communities to better fund schools, or to provide more resources for healthy, affordable foods, housing, and medications for marginalized communities.
Woo, Erin, run for office. Yes. I agree. You know, it's hard to make that change on the ground. And this is why, you know, part of this presentation is about making change personally and interpersonally with patients. I mean, it's hard to make systemic change when you also are not at the top. You know, if you are not the director of the whole URMC, how can you affect policy change that isn't going to take substantially longer than trying to do small actions first, right? And there are, there are community organizations, clinics, you know, that may be potential opportunities for partnership. There's even food pantries and other drives that are started initiatives. Free the People Rock is one that communities like the URMC might consider working with to actually start affecting those changes, for sure. Thank you for that comment. Thank you, Tommy. Yes, you can find Free the People Rock on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook.
Additional resources coming up on the 21-day challenge is a list of other community programs that are actively working to improve the Rochester community. And so you all will have access to that as well as a way of going to the source to learn more about what's being done and how you can help impact change on an individual basis.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I think if that's all the questions for now, my part of the presentation is completely finished. So thank you, everyone.
Wow. Thank you, Ms. Egan, for the gift of your time, experience, expertise, and perspective. And really, thank you for sharing space with us. To our participants, we hope that you found today's lecture inspiring and uplifting. So far as a collective, as Ms. Egan highlighted today, we have worked on identifying the multiple levels in which racism operates through important topics and concepts, bringing to light the issues of institutional racism, prejudice, and bias. And during our debrief last Friday, we pushed ourselves further as we processed difficult emotions and as we shared with each other the ways in which we navigate that system on an individual and interpersonal level. As you likely saw from our challenges over the weekend, we are now exploring the dynamic and interactive intersectionality of different social categories. We hope you will begin to see the ways these categories interact with each other to provide privileges or to create disadvantages for different people. This week, as you continue to expand your perspectives, we challenge you to consider the barriers to achieving health equity. We encourage you to use the resources on the 21-Day Challenge main page under the Reflection tab. This Friday at 12 noon, please join us for a debrief as we consider these barriers together and share the growth that we have made through this process. And then join us again on Monday, next Monday, February 21st at 12 noon, when we welcome Dr. Jeffrey McCune, Director of the Frederick Douglass Institute in the School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Rochester. His topic will be Courageous Conversations. Also, there's still time to sign up for the 21-Day Challenge online at www.urmccelebrates.com. Thank you all and have a wonderful day and happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.